Well, good afternoon, everybody. Jason O'Dwyer from Master Electricians again. And this is, I can't even count the number of webinars I've hosted over the last couple of weeks. So we must be getting well into double digits, that's for sure. So again, today's webinar is really about mental health and wellbeing. We've had a bit of a focus. We had our friends from Mates in Construction with us last week. But a little bit of a different tact, I suppose, today is with Carly from SuperFriend. SuperFriend deliver mental health and wellbeing sort of advice and services to all the industry super funds, so Energy Super and all the other industry super funds, Hester, Australian Super, etc. That's not mentally using. They provide these sort of information sessions for members and for employers as well. I was just saying to Carly, we're into the grind, I suppose, at the moment with social distancing, and people have now been home for a little while, and we've got the initial adrenaline rush and things like that. So it'll be important to see how people are coping and checking in with people. And giving employers some checks and balances, I suppose, to help their workforces as well. I was just saying to Carly as well, there's been some difficult conversations had with people. Heard one on the radio this morning about a family breakup that's been effectively caused by everybody living at home. So I think it's a good time for us to have a bit of a check about this. Yeah, talk to people and give people some coping strategies and go from there. So as usual, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A process. So you've all your microphones have been turned off. But if you do have a question, please type it into the Q&A area, and then I'll pass that on to Carly, and I'll get her to address that. So without further ado, you're not here to listen to me, but I'll pass over to Carly. And Carly, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason, for that really kind introduction. I'm really excited to be spending the next 90 minutes with you guys this morning. So as much as I would prefer to be talking to you all in person, this is the world we're living in now. So looking forward to giving a really good presentation for you guys today, and hopefully giving you some really practical tools around managing your mental health and wellbeing. Not just now with the environment that we're living in, but all the time. So as Jason mentioned, my name's Carly Webster. I'm a solutions manager for SuperFriend. We manage mental health and wellbeing for workplaces essentially all across Australia, with a big focus on our industry super funds and partners. So my experience is predominantly in health science and workplace mental health. I've spent a bit of time working for Allianz Insurance in their workers' compensation and injury management department, doing a range of different roles there, as well as in workplace mental health consulting and organisational psychology. But I also do a fair bit of work with the AFL and Richmond Football Club, managing some of their athlete player mental health and wellbeing programs as well. So two different sides of the world there, but hopefully I can give you guys some really good insights today on managing your mental health. So we'll get started. So today we've got quite a few different topics to cover. We'll start by talking a little bit about defining the difference between mental health and mental illness. We'll delve a little bit deeper into understanding mental ill health and what that looks like. I will then cover off understanding and managing COVID-19 anxiety and what that actually is. And we'll also talk a little bit about remote and flexible work and the changes that have happened to our workplace because of COVID. And finish off with a little bit around having a conversation with somebody, how to do that if they are struggling. And lastly, but certainly not the least important, I'd probably say the most important, will be self-care and how to look after yourself at challenging times like this. So without further ado, we will get into it. So in this first section, I really want to talk to the group about the difference between mental health and mental illness. And I kind of like to start off this section with showing some of the stats and the state of mental health in Australia presently. Now, some of these stats that I'm about to show you really highlight why addressing mental health in the workplace is really, really critical, and also why the state of mental health is as it is right now in Australia. So I'm going to show the group a short video which will explain some of the stats around mental health in Australia right now. So those stats, guys, probably aren't so surprising. Some of them we may have seen before, and some may actually still surprise us. What I do want to point out is that the biggest stat that we saw there was that 1 in 5 people will struggle with their mental health in any given year. Now, as much as that might seem like the numbers have increased over recent times, what the stats actually tell us is that awareness has grown, yes, which is great. So we understand mental health better now than we ever have, but it doesn't necessarily mean that more people are struggling with their mental health now. Our understanding has increased and more people are actually out there seeking treatment, talking about it, and getting support, which is really, really good to see. Some of the stats, however, are a little bit more shocking. And one of the ones that really stands out for me and continues to blow my mind is that each day we lose 8 people in Australia to suicide. Now, that stat always blows my mind. And the reason that that is because for every one of those 8 people, there are actually 30 more attempts every single day. So that's a lot of people that are feeling quite desperate and needing to take those quite drastic steps. What I would like to say about that as well is there's still a big reluctance from people in Australia to seek support. And we know that 60% of people suffering from a mental health condition or struggling with their mental health don't actually seek the right support. Now, there's a range of reasons for that, but today we'll talk a little bit around what support looks like and how we as individuals in the community and in our workplaces can help to decrease some of the stigma that exists around mental health. Now, one of the things that I really want everybody to think about today and to try and flip your thinking on a little bit is the definition of mental health. When I say the words mental health, and I hear this a lot with groups that I present to, our mind automatically goes to the negative or to mental illness. But what I want you to flip your thinking on is when we hear the words mental health, let's think about mental health in terms of comparing that to our physical health. So as much as, yes, we know 1 in 5 people have mental ill health and have mental illness, 5 out of 5 of us have mental health. and we should be proactively managing our mental health to maintain positive well-being. Now, what I mean by that is just like we exercise, we eat well, we manage our sleep, they're all proactive ways that we look after our physical health to stay well. Now, there's lots of different strategies, and we'll talk through them today, around how we can proactively look after our mental health and stay well. And by staying well, hopefully we can avoid either falling into that 1 in 5 bucket, or if we do, we can actually recover quicker and become healthy again quickly with the right support. So I just want to flip our thinking on that a little bit today. Now, I really wanted to show you this stat as well, because it kind of does show how the trajectory of mental health has changed in recent times. Now, the World Health Organization back in 2011 actually predicted that depression would be the leading cause of disability worldwide by 2030. Now, this was above any other kind of physical condition, whether it was heart disease, whether it was cancer, lung disease, etc. Now, fast forward only 7 years later, which is well before that 2030 date, the World Health Organization actually confirmed that depression is now, in fact, the leading cause of disability worldwide. So we know that we need to be taking a lot more proactive steps in managing our mental health these days. What I'd like to show you guys now, just to conceptualize the concept around mental health a little bit more, is a short video around the mental health continuum. Now, this video comes from research done by Professor Corey Keyes, where he talks a little bit about mental health not being a linear journey, but more being a continuum where we will move in and out of different types of health over our life. So I'm going to start the video now, and then we'll just debrief a little bit on that following the video.
Health and illness. Two different ends of the spectrum, right? Why then, when we add this, do the two get confused for one another? If you ask someone what they think of when they hear mental health, more often than not, they'll think depression, anxiety, or bipolar, when in fact, these are mental illnesses. If we consider mental illness as a spectrum where one end is severe mental illness and the other is no mental illness, where someone sits on this spectrum is determined by a combination of environmental factors and biological factors. Traditionally, health professionals have focused on mental illness and how to help people who are ill become well. But that is only half the picture. Good mental health is defined as a state of well-being where one realises his or her own potential and can cope with the normal stresses of life. What if we added a vertical line to represent mental health, with the low side representing poor mental health or languishing, and the top representing high mental health or thriving? It's important to note that languishing does not necessarily rely on someone having a mental illness. Feelings of low or poor mental health, being disconnected and having low coping abilities can be felt by anyone. In contrast, a person in the thriving zone is high functioning, resilient, and well connected to life, with a sense of purpose and energy. And they can experience this while still having a mental illness. They may have sought appropriate help or treatment, be looking after themselves well, and be experiencing good mental health and thriving. Awareness is half the battle. Understanding where we sit in this spectrum helps us take appropriate action to improve our situation and ensure we thrive, whether we have a mental illness or not.
I really like that video because I think it really describes quite well how fluid the mental health continuum actually is. So what's really, really important to think about is that our mental health is not a linear journey. It doesn't have a start point and it doesn't have an end point. As we go through life and we experience different challenges, different life stages and different events, our mental health will fluctuate, and that is completely understandable and completely normal. You may fall into any of these categories over the time of your life. And what's really important to note is that if our mental health becomes low and we start to struggle a little bit with our mental health, it does not necessarily mean that we have developed a diagnosable condition. Just like if we have a diagnosable condition, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're not flourishing, we're not thriving, and we're not able to succeed in life. And I think that that video really explains that well. Some good examples of that, I think, are some high-profile people that we can probably think of and that we all probably know that have come out and spoken about their mental health struggles. And people that spring to mind for me are perhaps people like your Prince Harry, who has openly spoken about struggling with anxiety. Now he's thriving and he's flourishing and he's successful and doing quite well in life. Then we've got people like AFL footballers, Buddy Franklin, Dustin Martin, who have also quite openly spoken about struggling with their mental health over periods of time. Now that's just a really good example of how, yes, we can struggle. Our mental health might be low, it could be high. We could have a diagnosable condition versus not. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not thriving and we're not succeeding. So really just, again, want to flip our thinking on that and how we do actually conceptualize mental health. Now on that, we've spoken a little bit about the concept of mental health and also a little bit touched on mental ill health. Now I really want to talk and delve a little bit deeper into understanding mental illness. And I'll define that a little bit further for you. In this section, I think it's really important to understand the concepts behind it, but not get too diagnostic or too clinical in terms of our understanding. And that will make sense as we move into the topic. So I'd really like to touch here now on the most common types of mental illness that we see in Australia. And the two most common that we would see are anxiety and depression. And we've all probably heard of these before, but might not necessarily understand the ins and outs. Now, what I will say is that this information here is a guide, definitely a guide. And also, I don't want to get too clinical or too diagnostic here. It's just really about understanding the basics. So when we talk about anxiety, it's really important to understand that we all can feel worried, stressed, or under pressure at points of time in our life. And that is normal, depending on life circumstances. Anxiety, however, is when our anxious feelings, or those feelings of anxiety, actually don't subside and they have no particular cause or reason. Now, what I will say with that is that if we feel feelings of anxiousness on 1 day, 2 days, or here or there, that does not necessarily mean that we've got anxiety. Any kind of mental health condition has set diagnostic criteria. And the diagnostic criteria for suffering anxiety actually means that you're feeling those anxious feelings, those physical symptoms of things like hot and cold flushes, racing heart, tight chest, excessive worries, etc., for a period of 6 months or more. Now, that's really important that we grasp that it is 6 months or more. It is not just a few days of feeling anxious here or there due to understandable life events. Now, when we talk about anxiety, anxiety is usually worries about the future and worried about our future path or things that might not have necessarily happened yet. Depression, on the other hand, is usually thoughts or ruminating about things that have happened in the past. So that can be a good way to distinguish those two things. Now, when we talk about depression, again, a normal state is that we would all feel sad, moody, low, a little bit flat here and there due to normal life events. This, however, becomes a problem when feelings of sadness or feeling low persist for longer periods of time, and they actually affect the way that we function in everyday life. Now, in order to meet diagnostic criteria for depression, those feelings of sadness or low that are affecting our functioning and well-being need to persist for 2 weeks or more. Now that means that perhaps my work performance may be affected for 2 weeks or more. I may not be able to get out of bed and function for 2 weeks or more. Okay, so again, important to understand that it's not just a day here or there where we're feeling a little bit flat or a little bit down. Now, when we talk about workplace stress isn't necessarily a diagnosable condition, and stress actually doesn't have a diagnostic criteria. But most jobs do involve some stress, and it's important to note that some stress is actually reasonable and can be really helpful in helping us to perform our best. When stress, however, becomes a problem is when it's excessive, more than we're able to cope with, and it's ongoing and persistent, and it does start to affect our well-being and the way that we function. Importantly, as much as stress isn't a diagnosable condition, stress actually can contribute to the development of a diagnosable condition, or if we've got pre-existing, perhaps anxiety or depression, can actually worsen that if we don't get on top of it and manage it. Now, what I really wanted to highlight with all of this information is by no means is anyone, unless you're a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a doctor, etc., meant to be an expert on any of this. Okay, it's just a matter of having that base knowledge and understanding. The most important thing that we should be focusing on, however, when we're talking about mental health, is observable behaviours. Now, as a friend, as a family member, a colleague, etc., this is where having a bit of a knowledge can be really beneficial in supporting those around you that could be struggling. Because it's not your job to diagnose, it's not your job to be a psychologist or a counsellor, etc. But if we understand some of the observable behaviours and mood fluctuations that people around us are experiencing, we can actually start to support and help people in their recovery and in acknowledging that something may not be right now. The great thing about observable behaviours is that they're tangible and that we can usually see them. And if we can see them and we can notice them, that's when we can actually address them with a person. So I'll explain that in a bit more detail. We all have normal mood fluctuations on a day-to-day basis, but sometimes if these are persistent and they're ongoing, it can start to contribute to potential illness or risk of illness. Now, when we talk about observable behaviours, as like I said before, a friend, a colleague, a family member, these are really good patterns in behaviour that we can notice if something may be going on with somebody that we do care about. Now, if someone's just has one day of being a little bit irritable, a little bit down, a little bit flat, maybe they're a little bit more withdrawn than usual, it may be nothing. Okay, but if those patterns persist, observable behaviours are a really good way for us to be able to pick up on that and address it with the person. So, for example, if I notice that a colleague or a friend has been a little bit more irritable than usual, perhaps they aren't performing that well at work, they've been a little bit angry, haven't been talking as much, getting involved in lunches or work activities, I can use those observable behaviours to address my concerns with the person. So, for example, hey, I've noticed you've been a little bit more quiet than usual, and you know, you haven't been coming to team lunches. Is everything okay? Now, in having that conversation, you might be raising this with the person and nothing might be wrong, which is fine. You are just showing that you've cared. On the flip side of that, you might be the only person that's noticed that that person hasn't been themselves. And perhaps that's a trigger for the person that, hey, somebody does care, somebody has noticed, and maybe I actually do need some support because I'm not doing too well right now. So really important for these behaviours that we notice them, we know them, we acknowledge them, and then following that, we're able to have a conversation and point them out to show that we care and to show that support is available. Now, moving on, we're going to actually talk a little bit now, which will be probably quite topical for everybody, is a little bit about COVID-19 anxiety specifically. So we are obviously in a very unique situation right now where our mental health may be challenged. And for some people, this could be the first time that we're experiencing some mental health struggles, or that we've noticed that our mental health's been a little bit more challenged or low. And for some people with pre-existing issues, that could also be amplified. In this section, I want to talk in defining COVID-19 anxiety a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about resilience and coping, and some proactive strategies that we can put in place to manage some of that. So COVID-19 anxiety, it's very topical right now. There's a lot of information, probably too much information out there that can become quite overwhelming. And I want to try and conceptualize, I guess, and normalize some of the things that we might be feeling as a community right now. So this image that you see on the screen right now is really quite a common image, referred to most often as the stress curve or the anxiety curve. Now this image and the stress curve here talks about our level of stress as humans. Now, like I mentioned before, some feelings of stress and anxiety are normal, and can actually be really helpful for our performance. And like I mentioned before, it's when those feelings get excessive or overwhelming or persist for too long that they are unhelpful. Now, as humans, in the way that we actually evolved, we need stress and we need anxiety because it helps us survive. Now, you all would have heard about the fight, flight or fight response that we all have as humans. And this is what this stress curve actually talks about. So you can see down in the bottom, the first corner where it talks about being too relaxed and not sufficiently motivated. Now, this area here is where we are probably not enough anxiety, not enough stress actually exists. And we might actually be a little bit bored and not challenged. As we go up the curve, you'll see right in the middle that there's peak arousal and performance. Now, this is when we've got the most ideal and effective amount of stress or anxiety. And this is where we will usually actually perform our best. And that area up there of that peak anxiety or peak stress can actually differ for individuals in terms of how much stress or anxiety we need to function and perform at our best. As we start to go down the curve, this is where we become too anxious, that we can't focus, perhaps we're distracted by our anxiety symptoms, and perhaps the stress levels are just a little bit higher than what we can tolerate and what we can handle. Now, like I mentioned, the level of stress that each individual can operate under can be completely different. It's important to understand that. So I'll use myself as an example for this one. If we're looking at stress on a scale of 0 to 10, so 0 being no stress, 10 being a lot of stress, I personally know that I need probably a level of 7 or 8 stress to perform at my absolute best. So I need a little bit of pressure, I need a tight deadline, and I need just a little bit of stress and anxiety to give me that adrenaline rush to get something done. Now, other people that I work with might only operate on a 2 or a 3 out of 10. They need minimal stress. And that's important to know because we're all different in a workplace and we're all different in our family lives as well. So knowing what each person can tolerate can actually be really effective in understanding and working with each other in managing our mental health and well-being. Now, this stress curve is actually used also quite a lot in sport and athletic performance. For example, we don't want our AFL footballers going out onto the field feeling bored or tired or not having that adrenaline rush. We also don't want them going out on the field feeling too anxious and worrying about everything that they do, because then they will make mistakes, they'll make errors. Okay, so that's where it's important to have that right level of stress. Now, why is that relevant right now? Some people might be feeling uncomfortable right now because they're experiencing feelings of anxiousness that they've never had before. And what I'd like to say is that that is completely understandable in the current environment that we're living in, because it is a highly stressful environment. And why is that? Humans naturally, how we have evolved, are uncomfortable with change and uncertainty. It's not a state that we enjoy living in, and it's not a state that we actually thrive in. There's lots of events that are also out of our control right now. Our work environment may have changed. Some of us may be working from home, and our family circumstances have changed. So we've got very little control over our lives right now. And again, humans do not thrive in that kind of environment. One of the biggest reasons why we might be feeling anxious right now as well is that our safety and our livelihood has actually been threatened by the current pandemic that we're living in. And again, that is our human instincts kicking in. We've got too much anxiety, too much stress, too much change. So our survival mechanisms kick in. Our fight, our flight, our freeze is on absolute overdrive right now. Another reason why we might be feeling anxious is that we're experiencing what's called universal grief right now. Everybody has lost something, whether it be big or small, whether it be we've lost our weekend sport versus we've lost our job. There's lots of loss going on right now, and everybody is experiencing grief, essentially for life as we knew it before and some normality. Now, there are things such as the presence of health anxiety. We're worried about catching coronavirus. We're washing our hands excessively. We've all of a sudden all become germaphobes. That's anxiety provoking in itself. Some of us may also be doubting our coping ability or questioning our coping ability. One of the other things, I guess, that is annoying about the human brain and the way that we were built is that the human brain actually has what we call a negative bias. Now, what the negative bias means is that our brains were actually designed and actually function by noticing more negative than positive. So we're actually, as humans, programmed to notice negative things 3 times more than positive things. So that's when that worst case scenario thinking starts to set in a little bit. And that's when things like misinformation, too much information, things like social media, watching too much news, etc., can really make our anxiety and our stress peak at these times. Also, our family and our network has been impacted, and people that we care about. Now, I can put my hand up straight here and say that I know one of the things I'm struggling with right now is not being able to see my family and the people that I care about. And that can promote feelings of anxiety. Now, the key thing that I really wanted to highlight here is that this is all normal. Okay, this is all understandable with what we're going through right now. So really important that we're kind to ourselves, we acknowledge that those feelings of anxiousness exist, and we understand that they're normal. If they do, however, start to affect us and become intrusive and impact on our well-being, that is when we do need to seek support. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So moving on now to resilience and to coping. Now, you've all probably heard the word resilience thrown around a lot. And to start out, I just wanted to, I guess, dispel a few myths about the word resilience. Often I've heard resilience described as being strong or being weak. I've heard people say things like, we're born with resilience, you either are or you're not. And I've also heard people say, oh, it's just get over it, it's about moving on, have a cup of concrete and off you go. Now, that is all false. That is all misinformation. resilience by no means is about being strong or weak, okay? We are not born with resilience. Yes, some people are more resilient than others, but we can build our resilience as humans, okay? We're not stuck and we're not in a static position where we either are or we're not. There's plenty of things we can do to build our resilience. Now, when we talk about resilience, the best definition that I've probably come across is, you know, despite challenges, despite adversity that we're going through, resilience is about having a mental state or a mental outlook to work through our difficult feelings or our challenging feelings, to overcome that anxiety and to recover, okay? And you may have heard it termed as the ability to bounce back, which is great. But it's about that ability to feel the feeling or feel the challenge for what it is, by no means squash it or ignore it, interpret the situation and then be able to move forward. Now, I like to use this model on the side here called the ABC model of resilience, and it really explains it quite well. So we start with an adverse or a challenging situation, and our beliefs and our attitudes will help us to interpret that situation, analyze it, think about it, understand how we feel about it. And then the consequences are what we do or how we feel as a result of the situation. And what I'd really like to say for that last bit there is that there is a choice around that. Now, why is this important right now with what we're going through? It's important because there's a lot that's out of our control right now. And knowing what is and is not in our control is a really, really critical piece to being able to adjust our attitudes, adjust our expectations, and adjust our responses, but also help us to stay a bit grounded and maintain some perspective right now as well. And I'd like to introduce you, I guess, in terms of talking about what is and isn't in our control, to a concept called the locus of control. Some of you may have heard of this before, some this may be a completely new concept. Now, when we talk about the locus of control, this concept was first introduced in psychology probably about in the 80s by someone called Julian Rotter. Now, he spoke about people's attitudes and behaviours and how they affect essentially the outcome of their lives, and how our mindset and the way that we conceptualise life events actually can have an impact on the quality of our life and our well-being moving forward. So there's two different concepts that sit around our locus of control. We've got our internal locus of control, which talks about things that I have control of personally, which are things like my attitudes, my beliefs, my actions, etc., versus external, which is a mindset that others control what happens in my life, what outcomes occur in my life. So you can see that those two concepts are quite different. When we talk about internal versus external, I sometimes like to use a bit of a footy example here, because I'm a bit of a footy nut, and I hope there's some footy fans listening. A really good way to conceptualise this concept of locus of control is thinking about when your footy team's playing, for example. I'll put my hand up and say when Collingwood's playing. When your football team's playing and you lose the game, if I was internally focused or had an internal mindset around that, I would say Collingwood didn't play their best. We missed a lot of goals. We, overused the ball, and there are lots of skill errors in the game on Collingwood's behalf. That's me having an internal mindset around what I can control. On the flip side of that, if I was to think externally, my excuses would be Collingwood lost because the umpires were terrible, the other team got too many free kicks, etc., etc. Okay, so you can see that one is taking ownership, external is placing blame on those external factors around us. Now, why is this important right now in the coronavirus and the pandemic world that we're kind of living in? It's important because it helps us maintain perspective, because there is a lot out of our control right now. So thinking about the things that we can control can help us to really ground ourselves and to help us decrease our levels of stress and anxiety, because we're not focused on what's not in our control. So things that are in our control is our attitude, how much news we watch, how much we follow government advice, how much social media we're believing, or how much time we're spending on social media, reading information that may or may not be true, what our home routine looks like, and if we're taking control over our home routine, if we're choosing to do some fun and some different things, and what our attitudes like in terms of kindness, gratitude, grace, etc. They're things that are very much in my control. Things that aren't in my control are things like if others follow social distancing rules, trying to predict what will happen, trying to predict the future, how long this will last, how long will be social distancing for, what decisions the government makes, and things like how much toilet paper other people are buying or other people's actions. They're things that are completely out of my control. So you can see if we focus on those external things too much, that can have a really negative impact on our mindset and our well-being. So important to just acknowledge those things, what we are in control of and what we're not in control of, to keep that balance. Now, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of information out there right now around strategies for coping and how we can, prioritise some things for our mental well-being. It can actually become quite overwhelming, the amount of advice that's out there. One piece of advice that I think is really good and I think is really, really positive has come out from the Mental Health Commission. Now, the Mental Health Commission has put out these key tips tied with #inthistogether, and it gives us some really good guidance around things that we should be prioritising and actions that we should be taking to manage our mental wellbeing right now. So things like seeking support, because it's totally okay to not feel okay right now. Making sure that we understand when we are struggling and seeking support as we need it. Things like following the facts and avoiding misinformation. That might be taking a break from the news or taking a break from social media to avoid that information overload. Talking, not typing. Some of us are working from home right now, and a lot of us aren't seeing people face to face. So yes, we can text message or email, but how about picking up the phone or doing video to maintain that as close to in-person communication that we can. Things like a routine. Routine has never been more important than it is right now. I can put my hand up and say I'm not a very good routine person, but I've acknowledged the importance right now. And that's really helping my mindset, I know that. And a couple of other ones that I'd like to point out as well around staying connected and getting creative in the ways that we do connect with people. Getting sweaty, making sure that we're getting out and exercising no matter what our capability. So it might be a walk, it might be a run, might be doing some exercise, it might even just be walking the dog. But getting out in that fresh air is super, super important for our well-being. And things like, financial stress right now is a real thing. And it's important that we do talk about it, because a lot of people are actually struggling. So don't suffer in silence, I guess, is the key tip that I'd give you there. It is real. Let's talk about it and let's look at what solutions are out there for us. There's no harm or shame in accessing support where you need a bit of a chop out financially right now. So I'll leave that with the group to digest some of those things a little bit more, but I'd suggest having a look on the Mental Health Commission website and just having a look at some of those tips a little bit more, because they're really, really good. Now, in this next section here, guys, I'd like to talk to the group a little bit about remote work and what that what that's doing for us right now. Now, I know a portion of your workforce is actually working from home right now. But also for those that aren't working from home, there's some real differences and some real challenges with things like social distancing in the workplace, different levels of flexibility required. So I'd like to talk a little bit to that, and some of the positives and negatives that can come from added flexibility in the workplace. So when we talk broadly about work and mental health as a concept, work for humans is really positive. It's something that gives us purpose. It's something that gives us a sense of meaning in life. But work can be both a promoter and a detractor to our mental health. Now, this is just in normal times, not just with what we're going through right now. Now, when work is positive for our mental health, that's when we're experiencing things like supportive leadership. We've got good role clarity, good expectations around what we need to do to achieve. We feel valued, we feel rewarded. We've got routine and structure, teamwork. We've got our social connection, and we belong. And we've also got support and work-life balance. That's when we're absolutely thriving and kicking goals at work, when we've got ticking all of those boxes. Now, like I mentioned before, work can actually be a detractor to our mental health if things aren't going completely as we would hope for them to go in the workplace. Now, when work may actually be negative on our mental health is when we've perhaps got things like excessive stress, we're not necessarily feeling valued at work, there may be poor leadership or a lack of support in the workplace, we don't have control or autonomy over our work. We might also have things like unrealistic targets, there may be bullying and harassment, poor lack of recognition, etc. And work can then actually detract from our mental health if some of those factors are present in our job. Now, it's important right now to acknowledge that workplaces are completely different to the norm. Okay, we're all operating in a completely different world than what we're used to. And with that comes some additional challenges. Now, work, when flexible, can be really positive for our mental health. Now, flexibility means a range of different things. It might mean work from home. It might mean we've got different hours, either later start times, earlier finish times. It may mean that we work part-time, job share. It may also mean, like right now, we've got different processes in place due to things like social distancing. So there's some pros and cons to flexible and remote work that I think are really worth pointing out. We know that on the positive side, when we've got more control and more satisfaction and less workplace stress, that these are really positive for our mental health. And flexible work can be really good at promoting those two things. Now, flexibility is positive for our mental health because it does give us choice and autonomy in the way that we work. It gives us control over the how, the when, the where of how we work. And it also gives us a little bit more work-life balance and time for that life admin stuff that we might not usually get time to do. It also gives us more time to focus on our well-being and our health. And there's actually evidence to suggest that there's less perceived workplace stress when we do have flexibility around the way that we're working, as well as having more time for family, friends, and you time, essentially. On the flip side of that, however, there are actually some negatives to things like work from home, workplace flexibility, and this is probably amplified right now with what we're dealing with coronavirus. These are things like decreased social connection. Now, that's probably the biggest factor and what we're missing the most right now in terms of our work relationships. Things like a loss of feedback loop. We might not have as much access to our supervisor or our manager right now for that feedback, encouragement, support, etc. Less people interaction, There's actually evidence to suggest that when we work from home or we work flexibly, that we actually put in more hours and we have more sedentary time, more time sitting, less breaks. And we've actually got quite blurred boundaries between home and life, and being able to switch off and alternate between those two different states. But one of the key things that I really wanted to point out that people are kind of lacking in the workplace right now, or that's having the biggest impact, is really that social connection that we are kind of missing. Now, I think this is really important to point out, because before all of this happened, before we were in the COVID-19 pandemic, Australia was already in the midst of a loneliness epidemic. Now, a report came out in 2018 called the Australian Loneliness Report. And this was the largest study that was ever done on loneliness in Australia. Now, this study was done by the Australian Psychological Society and Swinburne University. And they interviewed over 2,000 Australian people to look at the levels of loneliness in the community and in society. Now, this report showed us that 1 in 4 Australian adults actually feel lonely in day-to-day life, and 55% of the population feel a lack of companionship. Now, keeping in mind that this was before COVID-19, you can only imagine the impacts that this is having on people from a social perspective, from a mental health perspective, as we speak right now. Now, we know that loneliness is also connected to poorer quality of life and lower psychological well-being. And that can be a worry, because we know as well that it can also become a bit of a cycle. So as you can see in the arrows on the side of the page here, loneliness actually increases our experience, our likelihood, of experiencing depression by 15%. But on the flip side of that, being depressed actually increases our chance of loneliness as well. So it becomes a bit of a cycle. The lonelier we are, the increased chance of our mental health being impacted. And as our mental health is impacted, the lonelier we can actually feel. So it does become that bit of a vicious cycle. Now, why is this important? As humans, we need and we survive and we thrive off social interaction. And staying connected right now is so important and should be prioritised. In saying that, it's really important to not overdo it, because it's about quality, not quantity. I'm hearing a lot of people at the moment talking about too much video conferencing, that it's tiring, too many video meetings, etc. And that's true if we're not getting the balance right. So it's really important that we're focusing on quality social interaction with those that we care about, with those that we get value out of, rather than just quantity and trying to overdo it. So important for workplaces to recognise that, but also individuals to recognise that as well. So I won't touch on this for too long, because I know that only a small portion of staff are working from home right now, but I just wanted to give a few tips on how we can actually make work from home work for us right now. So a few little tips here, like dress for your day. Now, I'm not saying put on your suit each day, and I know who we're talking to today from Masters don't necessarily wear a suit. But those that are working from home right now and are office bound, usually wear comfortable clothes, but don't necessarily spend the day in your pajamas, is what I'm saying here. So dress that you are comfortable and that you can function, and that you know that you're on work time. Dedicating a space, really important, so we're not blurring those boundaries between home and work. Now, I know that's not possible for everybody if you live in a small apartment, for example, but trying to just dedicate an area that is for work only, if possible, is really important. Just like it's important to build a routine. Now, this goes for whether you're working from home or not. Routine is super important right now. And what I will say is don't try and plan too far ahead, okay? Build a routine, build a to-do list, but do that at the start of every day or in blocks of a couple of days at a time. Because things are rapidly changing right now, don't set yourself up to fail with building out a month-long routine, okay? Because things will change and priorities will change. So giving yourself a to-do list or a bit of a routine on a daily basis will be really positive in reinforcing that. Stay connected. We've spoken a little bit about that already. Make sure that you're getting outside as well. Like I mentioned, when we are working from home, we're a lot less likely to take our breaks. But make sure that we are either getting outside on our lunch break, after work, or even just for a meeting, and to be in a different environment. And on that, make sure that you are actually taking your breaks and not feeling guilty about doing that as well. Now, the last two are probably my, I guess, favourite or my biggest tips right now. And again, this is if you're working from home or not. Switch off and have a bit of a tech detox at the end of the day. Now, I know that a lot of us are staying connected through technology right now, and that technology is playing a really important role in helping us to achieve that. But it is also really important that we have some off time. Things like exposure to too much blue light that comes from our iPhones, that comes from our iPads, our computers, can actually impact on things like our sleep, if we're feeling fatigued or tired, and as well as our mental health and wellbeing if it's too much. So try and dedicate a little bit of time during the day that you can completely switch off. Turn off the computer, don't get on social media, even have some TV free time, and do something different. And that might be a great opportunity for you to get outside even and just try something outdoors, for example. So we've spoken a fair bit today around, firstly, mental health, mental illness, how to recognise some of the signs and symptoms, and some of the observable behaviours. And we've also spoken about COVID-19 anxiety and why we might be at heightened states of anxiousness right now. I think it's really important to touch on, now that we know that and we've kind of got that base knowledge, how do we have a conversation and how do we approach a conversation with somebody that we might actually be worried about? And that's what we're going to go through in this next section now. So what I will say, and I always really like to reinforce this with people, is that as much as it might be scary or daunting, there's nothing to lose by having a conversation with somebody about their mental health. But there is absolutely everything to gain. Now, some people might be hesitant to have a conversation with someone about their mental health, and there's a range of reasons for that. We might be worried about causing offence. We might be worried about making things worse. We also might be not wanting to get involved or not sure how they'll respond. But a lot of the time it's also that we don't actually know what to do or we don't actually know what to say. But there's no reason that that should hold us back. And the reason that I say that is because if you think about it this way, if you notice that somebody is struggling or they're not themselves or they're exhibiting some of those observable behaviours that we've spoken about, you noticing that and having the conversation, you may be the only person to have noticed these changes in their behaviour. Or you may also be the only person that has the courage to have the conversation. And without sounding dramatic or putting too much of a negative spin on it, you may actually be a person that saves that person's life as well. Now, I don't know about you, but I think a bit of a moment of awkwardness or a moment of uncertainty of having the conversation is certainly worth it if you are going to save somebody's life. Now, in terms of having a conversation, I've conceptualised this for you in 6 tips to try and make it nice and easy and nice and tangible. Now, what I will say about this to start off with is a couple of different caveats. You're not an expert, you're not expected to be an expert, and you also don't have all the answers. So don't put pressure on yourself to be that or to have all the answers. What I will also say is that the best way that you can ever approach a conversation with someone about their mental health is to be human, to be genuine, and be authentic in your approach. Okay, people will forgive you if you trip up or you make a mistake or you don't get it 100% right, if you are human and you're authentic and you're genuine in your approach. Okay, so please just keep that in mind. Now we'll talk through the tips now one by one, and hopefully can get a good grasp of what to do and have a little bit more confidence around having that kind of conversation. Now, step one, I think, is really the most important, and it's about being prepared. And when I say being prepared, the first thing that I'll always say is make sure that you are in the right headspace yourself to have a conversation with somebody else. Like they tell us when we get on an airplane, make sure you put your own oxygen mask on before you help anyone else. So if you're struggling or you're going through a difficult time and your stress or anxiety or mental health may be struggling right now, perhaps you're not the right person to have the conversation. But just have a think about that yourself. Now, in terms of being prepared, it's also important to think about a good time, a good place. Consider things like privacy and finding the right forum to do that in. And also make sure that you brush up a little bit on what supports and what resources might be available if, for example, the person does say that they're struggling. So what solutions or options have you got to discuss with the person if they do say that they are struggling right now? Now, step two is asking if they're okay. Now, we all would probably be familiar with the Are You Okay Day campaign, and it can just be as simple as that. Be relaxed in your approach is what I will say, number one. Asking if they're okay is that first step in opening up the door to that open communication. And being relaxed can really help the person to open up. Now, this is where the observable behaviours that we spoke about a little bit earlier can come into play and be beneficial. So you might start by talking about some of the changes that you've noticed in the person's behaviour or that you may be concerned about, and then follow up by asking, is everything okay right now? Are you going okay right now? Now, that's where you open the door and give them the opportunity to share. And that's where step three comes into play. Hear their story. Remember that it is about them. You are encouraging them to talk and to open up. And you're being patient, you're not interrupting, and you're not trying to offer solutions too quickly. Really important here that you are patient, but you also accept that they might actually not be ready to talk about it right now as well. And that's okay. Okay, all you can do is ask. If they're not ready and they don't want to talk about it, we can't force them to talk about it. And that's where step four then comes into play with being prepared and having a bit of a plan B. So what if they don't want to talk about it? What if they get angry or upset or offended or shocked that you've asked? That's okay. Don't take it personally. They just might not be ready, or they might actually just be a little bit taken aback and not expect that conversation. Now, it's important here that you just reinforce that you're only asking because you care, and this is where your genuine care and compassion really comes into play. If, for example, in this situation, though, they don't want to talk about it, but you are really concerned for the person and there may be a risk of harm, or they're expressing things like suicidal thoughts, for example, that's when you should seek immediate support and assistance, because it might be outside of your scope to be able to assist that person right now. Step number 5 is about encouraging action. Now, if you've had the conversation and a person has said that they are struggling and that they do need support, this is where you can play a really a critical role in helping them seek support. So you might help them just brainstorm some ideas around what happens next, or you might even talk to them about things like seeking support through their GP, through a psychologist, through an employee assistance program that your workplace offers. And you might even need to help them make those steps if they need that and if they give you permission to help. Importantly though, a simple chat and just asking them if they're okay may have done the job, and that might be all the action that is required. And that's where step 6 and the final step is really important. And this is about keeping the door open and keeping the conversation going. Now, what I mean by that is check in again, okay? Don't just treat this conversation as a one and done, okay? Job done, I've had the conversation. It's really important that you check in, you follow up, and you make sure that they are still going okay. And also that you reinforce that the door is always open and that you are available to help them as needed. Important, however, though, that you don't become that person's sole support and that they do have a support network around them that they can actually rely on. So to summarise on that point of the conversation, please do just remember that you are not an expert and that you're not expected to have all the answers. There's a lot of external support out there that you can lean on and that can assist in supporting you through that conversation as well, which is important. Now that leads us, I guess, to a really good and final segue for the presentation today. And this is about the importance of self-care. Now, this topic could not be any more important right now. And we are going to touch on how you can best look after yourself right now. But not just now, forever and in life. Now, what I do want to say when we start talking about self-care is that self-care certainly should not be about more things to add on to your to-do list or more things that you need to prioritise or tick off in a day. Okay, it's really about keeping it simple and building a routine that you are having time to look after yourself. So just keep that in mind as we're talking through some of these concepts. So the first concept that I wanted to talk about this afternoon is about energy versus time, and what does that mean? Now, when we get busy or overwhelmed or stressed in life, most people's default position, or the way that most people respond to rising demands, is to actually put more on their plate or to put in more hours. So for example, if we start to get really busy at work and we've got a lot on, that's when you'll find that people start either working through their lunch break, not taking lunch at all, perhaps start coming in earlier or leaving later. Okay, this is not an effective way for us to manage our energy or our time. If anything, it actually decreases our productivity. And the reason that is because time is actually a finite process. Okay, there's only so many hours in the day. There's only so much time that we have in a day, a week, a month, etc. But energy is actually a different story. Now, when we talk about energy, energy is actually our capacity to be able to work. Now, what I mean by that is that energy is something that can be expanded and it can be renewed by putting certain rituals and habits in place to make sure that we're re-energized to be able to be productive. Now, what I mean by that, it's about getting more done in less time because we are actually recharged and we're feeling well and we're feeling productive. So a good example of that is if anybody's heard of the concept of ultradian rhythms or ultradian sprints. Now, this is a concept that talks about working in 90-minute cycles and then having some time to recharge. Now, I know when I'm in the workplace, I know that if I'm sitting down at my desk or absorbed in an activity for more than probably 2 or 3 hours, my attention span goes, my productivity drops, and my work quality actually drops. However, if I'm working in probably about 90-minute to 2-hour blocks, what I like to do is I like to take a break, whether it be go for a walk, go have a cuppa, go do a mindfulness activity, or even just go and have a chat to a colleague. When I come back to that activity or back to my work, I feel renewed, I feel recharged, and I perform better. Now, this is based on science, okay? It's not just a concept that sounds good. And there's been a lot of work done by Harvard University around the benefits of working in 90-minute sprints as well. Now, this concept of managing our energy actually comes into our personal life as well, around finding balance between work and play and looking after ourselves. Now, that's in the areas of our physical well-being, our work well-being, our emotional and psychological well-being, and also our spiritual well-being, and make sure that we're finding a balance between all of those different things that add to our well-being. Now, a really good way to actually look after our energy and renew and recharge is by building habits or building rituals. When we build habits or we build rituals into our day-to-day life, it means that these things and these activities that recharge us become more automatic and therefore less effort to complete. Now, this little habit loop image here that I've got talks to an experiment that was done in Germany. Now, in this experiment, they were trying to see if they could increase people's ability to exercise or commitment to exercise by building in a cue and a reward. So they would, in this experiment, put the person's shoes next to their bed. So when they woke up in the morning, they would be more likely to exercise. And after they exercised, they got a reward, which was chocolate. Okay, so kind of counterproductive when you think about it. But the whole concept there was around having a trigger for you to do something that's positive for yourself, complete that positive activity, and then reward yourself for that. Now, I'll share with you a little funny habit that I have. I know personally for myself that when I exercise in the morning, when I exercise before work, I set myself up for the best day possible. And I know that I feel my best on those days. So sometimes when my motivation drops or my motivation is lacking, I actually sleep in my exercise gear. Now, that might sound really funny and really strange, but it actually helps me to exercise in the morning because I know I'm ready to go and I know that I'm going to feel good after it. And if I'm waking up in my exercise gear, I'm halfway there, right? Okay, so the point that I'm trying to make here is around building in little tips, little cues that remind you to do those positive things for yourself on a daily basis. Now, the slide that I wanted to kind of finish on today before we move into our question and answer component of the session is around some ideas around how we can get balance in managing our well-being as humans. Now, this concept of 5 ways to well-being was developed by the New Economics Foundation and the UK government, and it talks to the concept of balance. Now, balance in terms of managing our well-being is really important as humans because there's lots of different cups that we need to fill up to feel well as people. Now, the 5 different areas or 5 ways to well-being that they talk to is connect, keep learning, take notice, be active, and give. Now, each of those have a little descriptor underneath, and I've actually, in this slide, put together some examples that are really specific to COVID right now, and things that can help us increase our well-being right now. So in terms of connecting with others we know is important for our well-being and helps us really as humans to kind of feel safe, less stressed and less anxious. So some examples that I've put down there of how we can stay connected right now are things like writing emails and letters to people that we care about, perhaps playing a video game with friends or family, things like online board games, hosting a virtual dinner or virtual drinks, and things like checking in on neighbours or community members that we know that might be struggling right now or need our support. When it comes to learning, we know as humans that staying curious and engaged with the world around us is a really good way to maintain well-being. And as humans, we need to keep our brain working to stay well. So right now, things that we can do to prioritise that if we're lacking in that area could be like taking an online course, perhaps learning that musical instrument that's been sitting in the spare bedroom with a YouTube course or something like that, an online cooking class, you know, reading some books that you've got piled up in the lounge room, or even just researching a topic that you've been interested in for a while, just to keep that brain ticking along and working. Now, in the take notice category, this is about being aware of what's going on around you and helping us to really focus on staying in the present moment. Because like I mentioned earlier, anxiety can be created by thinking too much about the future and not being grounded in the present moment. So the more that we can do to stay present and take notice, the better our mental state will actually be for it. So doing things like taking time to get outside and feeling the air, feeling the breeze, feeling the sun on our skin, doing things like mindfulness or meditation, downloading a cool app that helps us do that, and even practicing things like gratitude and noticing things that around us that we're grateful for or appreciating right now can help us to maintain perspective. Now, when we talk about being active, that one's pretty self-explanatory, but we know that staying physically active is important to our overall health and well-being and helps to clear our mind. Now, I'm a big fan and I love exercise myself, but it's really, really positive, the research that's coming out now around the fact that physical activity and exercise is as effective in managing our mental health as low-dose antidepressants. So again, it's not just a nice to have. There's research and there's evidence out there talking to that exact fact. So right now, with what we're going through, things like going for a walk, getting out, whether you're walking, you're running, whether you might be doing a step challenge with work, you might be able to do a bit of a workout in your house using some household items, or even doing like an online workout. There's lots of cool ones out there that you can probably get onto as well to be creative. And the last one here is about giving, and that's giving back and showing kindness to others. The cool thing about giving and kindness is that it actually has a twofold effect. And I'm a bit of a science nerd, but I really love the science behind this. Evidence actually shows that when we do something nice for somebody or we do something kind for somebody, our brain actually releases a chemical called oxytocin. Now, this chemical is the love or the hug hormone and makes us feel good as a person. So not only are you doing something nice for someone else, but you're actually releasing good chemicals and good hormones into your own system that should make you feel good as well. So things like giving compliments to those that make you feel good, thinking about a skill that you could potentially share with someone you care about, a friend, a family member, a neighbour, sharing knowledge, maybe walking your neighbour's dog because they can't get out, offering help to other people, running errands for those that are more vulnerable, all things that are giving back to the community and to other people that have a really positive impact. Now, what I really wanted to just finish on with this is that might seem overwhelming and more things on the to-do list, but what I'd encourage you to have a think about with those 5 different ways to well-being there is there an area that you think you're really lacking in right now and that you could really afford to focus on? Okay, now it's not about doing all of these things every day, but use it as a bit of a checklist and use it a bit of a guide of where you might be lacking and where you might be able to pick up and do a little bit more of, and just try and tick a couple of things off a day. But importantly, it should be because you want to, and because it is having a positive effect on yourself and helps you to look after yourself. Now, what I'll encourage everyone to just go away and have a think about today is one commitment, and that's it. So one thing that you're going to walk away from today and commit to prioritise your own mental health. Let's not make it complicated. Let's keep it simple and just think about one thing that's going to positively benefit us. So I hope there's a few things that you've taken away from today and enjoyed, and a few tips. I've really enjoyed spending the time with you. So thank you for having me, and I hope you all stay safe and well. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Carly. Really appreciate it. It's really in-depth stuff, and I think really topical at the moment for our members. In terms of, I'm going to kick off the questions, I suppose, if anybody's thinking or typing as we have our first question. Looking at, you sort of mentioned anxiety and depression, etc. And in my very unmedical type sort of view of the world, they're probably at what I would call the lower end of the spectrum of illnesses that could be experienced by people. Is there anything that people should do, or does advice change if people are thinking, well, actually, it's probably a bit more than anxiety and a bit more than depression. There's actually a real, well, when I say real, a more serious issue that someone's suffering from, whether it is bipolar or sort of what's it called? Anyway, but you know what I get.
No, I know. I know what you mean. For sure, like definitely depression and anxiety are your umbrella terms, and there's a range of conditions that actually sit under those, like you mentioned, bipolar, post-traumatic stress disorder, specific phobias, etc. Major depression, for example. Now, those conditions, yes, they have certainly a more serious nature. But what I would say with managing any kind of, whether it's diagnosed or undiagnosed condition, is that there's two different aspects there. There's all of the stuff that we've spoken about today around proactively managing your mental health on a daily basis, like you do your physical health. But when we get down the more serious end of the scale around those, more advanced psychological illnesses, that's when that formal support is really, really critical. Now, that can come in different formats. It may come from seeing your GP and managing it that way, but a lot of the time that will require formal psychological support, whether it's a psychologist, whether it's a psychiatrist, and sometimes may involve medication as well, okay? Now, when we're going through a situation like we're going through right now, those effects of those illnesses can certainly be escalated. And can certainly be presenting a lot more than they usually would. So for anyone struggling with that kind of stuff right now, I would say please prioritise your formal support in terms of psychological treatment for sure. Yeah.
Well, you've obviously covered the topic really well, because I've got no questions from anybody at the present time. So
great. I'll take it that I've nailed it then.
Well, I actually think you have. It's been really impressive in terms of what you've covered in the hour and a half or so. From our point of view, we might have understanding of this, and we actually might break it up into sort of 6 areas that you covered, and just make them bite-sized little videos that people can sort of come back to on
awesome.
our website as well. So yeah.
No, that's really great. I think something's just popped up in the chat. I'll just see what that is. So from Paul. So it's a thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thanks for that. No, thank you very much, Jason and team, today. I think it's been a really good session, and I'm really pleased to work with you guys today. So if there's any questions following, please reach out to Jason, and happy to also make any of the slides available as well for people, or any follow-up questions. So that's completely fine.
That'd be great. Thanks, Carly. I really appreciate your time. And
no worries.
Hopefully we keep. So are you a runner or you're a cyclist, or what do you do for the exercise?
Well, I do running. Right now I'm training for a marathon actually, but just to keep myself busy, but I actually play netball.
Fair enough. So yes,
Yeah.
I'm a fellow pavement pounder as well. So yes.
Yeah, right.
So
It's good timing. There's no better time to train for a marathon.
That's right. Absolutely. So anyway, enjoy your day, and
all right.
thanks very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Jason.
Thanks.
See ya.